Reverend Sharpton, thank you for joining us. And I wondered, 3 weeks on from George Floyd's death, what have you made from the reaction to his death, both in the United States and right across the world?
I think the reaction shows that there is a global concern that has been rising and bubbling up for some time now about the question of policing or law enforcement as it relates to people of color, black people in particular. And I think that the fact that the George Floyd murder happened in the middle of a pandemic when people were, for the most part, in the Western world, locked down, having nothing that they could go out to, no distractions, no sports events, nothing. And they're watching this video over and over again of a man handcuffed, pleading for his life, and a law officer putting his knee on his neck, giving no mercy or concern for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It brought back all of the accumulated cases, and it ended up making an outburst that happened all over the world. But I think that it was the buildup of so many consistent cases that this was the spark that just lit a fire of concern and activism all over the world.
Can it be sustained? Can it be built upon? I mean, we have had moments before in history when people have woken up to the oppression of black people in America in particular, and then it's drifted away again. This time, is it going to sustain?
I think that it can sustain. Already we're seeing governors in the United States change some police laws. We are seeing some mayors change. Minneapolis mayor has broken the police department in another way. Governor of New York has signed 4 bills that we've been wanting signed on policing for about 20 years. Other states are doing the same. They're raising different issues in Europe. Even President Trump is coming with an executive order on policing. It, in my opinion, is toothless, but he never even acknowledged there was a problem until now. The question is, in these moments, that you hold it and sustain it long enough to make some change, because you know sooner or later the moment will move. The question is that you have to make laws and policies that will outlast the moment. I'll give you an example. The civil rights movement in the 60s fought and was able in those few years to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, just in the United States this week, the Supreme Court ruled for LGBTQ people based on that 64 civil rights law. So we have the opportunity to make different policing laws, some of which are already being made on state level, but we want to do it federal. We have that opportunity to do it that would affect policing for generations to come. That's why we must seize this moment. That's why we're having a national march August 28th. We must seize the moment now to deal with how policing relates to race in this country and in other nations around the Western world.
One of the most spectacular aspects of this is the extent to which essentially it has been completely peaceful protest. Obviously there have been minor exceptions, but can it be delivered? Can the lifting of the knee from the neck, as you've described it, can that be achieved by peaceful protest alone?
I think it can, as long as the peaceful protest is geared toward legislative and policy change. If you study the movement in the United States, and I grew up in the movement in the northern part, it was the peaceful nonviolent movement of Dr. King, of the SNCC students. It was CORE and other groups that led to the 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act, 68 Open Housing Act. We had violence in the late 60s, but it didn't lead to direct legislation. It led to showing anger and outrage, which we needed to show. It led to some programs, but in terms of fundamental laws, it was nonviolent movements that did that. I think the peaceful protests that are going on now in America and in Europe and in England can lead to some very fundamental change if we're focused and disciplined that that's what we're doing it for, that we're not just venting, we are changing things.
What I think strikes many of us outside is that America has had a black president, and a much loved black president by many people around the world and even in America too. And yet it was possible for white policemen to murder a member of the public.
I think if you study American history, we've always had a step forward and then a step back. So we had Emancipation Proclamation and then Reconstruction. And immediately after that was the backlash, the KKK, the Supreme Court ruling that blacks did not have certain rights that we rightfully should have had. And they reeled back right after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the era of Reconstruction, is when white terrorism started through the Ku Klux Klan and others. In the beginning of the 20th century, when the NAACP and the Negro movement started against lynchings, it was the backlash that Jim Crow was institutionalized all over the South. So this one step forward, push one step back is what we've seen throughout American history. We had 8 years of a black president who was able to bring health care that disproportionately helped blacks, that began dealing with voting irregularities that handicapped blacks, that dealt with police brutality. He formed the 21st Century Task Force on Policing. I was involved in all of that with him. I was one of the civil rights leaders that worked and had access to him. We knew there would be a backlash, and Donald Trump was the backlash. So when you understand that we knew a backlash was coming, then you understand what Trump triumphed. He was the backlash that set a tone that made people feel that they could get away with what they started to not get away with under Barack Obama.
Are you worried about voting irregularities potentially in this presidential election to come?
I'm very concerned. When you see what happened in the primary in Georgia, where people had to stand in line for hours, and by some magic, only the machines in the black areas were not working. It was a wake-up call to us that we are rallying around and better be part of what we do on the anniversary of March on Washington, March on August 28th, to get people ready to go in early to make sure those booths are there to deal with early voting. We will have 3 months from the march where we will decentralize and deal with this state by state. I honestly feel if we do not do that, it is the intention of some forces to deny and suppress our vote and try to steal the election.
In the nicest possible way, you are really now facing having to vote for an elderly white man. Is he capable of, and I'm talking of course of Joe Biden, is he capable of delivering what the black population is demanding? What does he need to run definitely with a black running mate?
I think that he is capable. I think that the fact that he was the partner to the black president, Barack Obama, and even though we may have disagreed, and I did, with some of his earlier work in the 90s in the Senate, he was a co-pilot with Barack Obama. He understands what needs to be done. He thoroughly knows how to get legislation through. So I think he is capable. I also have said to him and said publicly, I would prefer him having a black running mate. That does not take away from his capacity, because the vice president doesn't set policy, the president does. But I think that it is time we have a black woman vice president in this country. As far as his age, he is 3 or 4 years older than Donald Trump. So we're talking about choosing between two older elderly white men. Joe Biden's not the only one elderly. 74 years old is elderly. That's what Donald Trump is. It's just that Joe Biden is not as bombastic, but bombast doesn't make you young. In some cases, it means you have less to say quietly of substance.
50 years on from Martin Luther King's great declarations. And one wonders, how long, O Lord? How long? How long before we reach a place in America where black people, where people of other ethnicities than white share with the white population absolute equality?
I don't know how long, and we don't know how long, but what gives me the courage to keep going, and I came out of the King movement. I joined as a teenager the year he died. And what gives me the discipline and determination to keep going is when he stood at Lincoln Memorial in 1963. It was exactly 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. If he could have continued that fight 100 years later, if we could, and I've met several times, had conversations with Nelson Mandela that spent 27 years in jail, we can't complain about continuing that fight when there are people that invested more time than we have in our lifetime, and we're depending that we would continue to fight. How long? Until we win. That's how long. However long it takes, we're not going to stop.
I'm wondering if you saw the image of Patrick Hutchinson, who was a black man, middle-aged, who was in a demonstration in London peacefully, and you see him picking up a right-wing white protester who had collapsed or been in some way disabled in the crowd, and carried him on his shoulder out into the throng to safety. For us, that was an amazing image, and I'm wondering if it was one that made it to your side of the Atlantic.
I saw it on television early one morning. I work out before dawn, doing physical workout. And I stopped my workout and watched this. And I said that this man reminded me of what Mahatma Gandhi said: we must become the change we seek. For him to show that kind of humanity, that kind of gesture, the one that he was opposed to. These are right-wingers that were marching that day. The Black Lives Matter march canceled because they didn't want a confrontation, but they had observations anyway. And this man helped to save somebody from possible harm, even though he was of an opposing view, which shows that we have the moral authority because we operate on a higher moral principle to raise these issues. We're not trying to be the counterbalance to those that promote violence and hate. We're trying to be the alternative and the moral barometer in which people can look at and say, no, this is the temperature we seek in society, not that. And the best way to show that example is putting a clean glass next to a dirty glass. That man, Patrick, did more to show the public of the values and moral outrage at his highest level than any of us could have done with a speech. And I respect him greatly. And I hope next time I'm in England I can meet him.
Two last brief questions. The first, on the other side of the equation, since the killing of George Floyd, we've had the shooting of Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. Is that a signal that the police have learnt anything in these intervening days?
It's a signal that it's going to have to take legislation and then enforcement. It's a signal that there are going to be those that will only do it if they see that they will be punished. And it's a signal that we cannot just let anybody on the force. Don't forget, right after the March on Washington in '63, they bombed a Birmingham church and killed 4 girls. There are always going to be those that don't care what happens or going to go backwards. We must be more determined that we are going to continue going forward.
Reverend Sharpton, thank you very much indeed for talking to us and giving us so much of your time. Thank you.